Good evening, good evening. I don't know if I need this, but I'll kind of hang around near it. I'm delighted to be here. I would just like to say that all of the people that were introduced from our staff who are here have names that are deceptive. They're all Polish. And I'd also like to acknowledge that there's a woman in the room who I've known for more than 60 years.
Not me.
She's still got another 15 years to go before she hits 60. It's my sister, Fran Foote, who is one of our volunteers. So let me just start here. The story of Polish women is a fascinating one. There's a great deal, both the story in Europe and the story in the diaspora in the United States and in other places where Poles settled, is a story that's really hasn't been told. And I see so many women here. It's too bad there are not more men, because they need to know this story. But it's something that I've been interested in since I began writing about immigrants. And I'm a historian, and one of the two topics that I write on is immigration. And in particular, my interest in immigration has focused to a significant degree on the history of Polish women. It's a story that follows the pattern of a lot of immigration stories, and there are some things obviously Polish women have in common with other women who've come, but it also has its wonderful eccentric qualities. There are all sorts of stories within stories. And one of the things that I always think of when I think of the experience of Polish women, people say, why did they come? What was their experience? I always think of an interview I read with a woman in the collection of interviews done in Chicago with the great Polish interview project, oral history project. And it was the story of this woman who, as a little girl, lived on a relatively prosperous farm in Wielkopolska. And her family was well-to-do, and they had tenants. And there was a girl about her age who was the daughter of the tenants they had. And she played with her. And she said, I was always the leader because my father owned the land. And I kind of bossed her around a lot. Anyway, after a couple of years, the tenants moved to the United States. They immigrated. And about a year later, she got a photograph and a letter from her friend, her playmate. Now they were in their early teens, and her old friend, her playmate, looked gorgeous. She had a beautiful dress on. Her hair was all fixed up. She looked like she was getting ready to go to the prom. And she looked at that and said, says, I used to boss you around. My family was more important than yours. Now you look like a countess. Said, I resolved after that, I'm going to that America. And then she said, I did come. And my life was miserable. I married the wrong guy. He was a drunk. He beat me. My children have abandoned me. I don't have any money. I'm just living on Social Security. I've always thought that God punished me, for being jealous and envious. It's one of those wonderful stories. She wanted to come to America because she too wanted to look like a countess. And one of the things we know is those pictures that immigrants sent back, especially sent back by women, they were gorgeous. They got themselves all fixed up. And in fact, in a letter that I'll read the part of to you later, this young woman is sending a picture back to her parents. And she said, I'm sending you my picture, but you probably won't recognize me. So that was one of their ways of showing they had kind of made it in America. Let me just say a couple things about the sources. One of the important sources is the Chicago Oral History Project. They just hundreds of interviews with people, and there are a lot of good stories. I haven't even obviously read them all, but that's one of the sources of the material that I use. Another is a very interesting collection called Writing Home. And it was put together by 3 historians, a husband and wife and their son. The son is someone that I knew quite well, Marcin Kula. And it's a collection of letters. And the story of the letters is very interesting in itself, because these letters were in the archives in Warsaw. And they went for years, from the 1890s right up to the First World War. Thousands and thousands of letters sent by immigrants in America, in Britain, in Brazil. Maybe you don't know, but there was a great movement of Polish peasants to Brazil in the 1890s. The Brazilian government was giving land. And these letters were collected by the border guards in the post office, because they read the letters. And those letters that said, "Immigrate, here's a ticket, why don't you come?" They didn't send them on, because they didn't want to encourage people to leave. And so you have this wonderful collection of letters that never got delivered. And all of them obviously have something to do with coming to America. But the terrible thing about it is that they were almost all destroyed by World War II. During the war, Professor Kula was conducting a seminar for the underground university, the Flying University. And he went to a friend of his and said, "I need some materials that we can discuss in my class." He was going to take it, the class was in his house. And he said, "Hey, listen, go to the archives. There's this wonderful collection of stuff. Your students will be able to work with this primary source material." And so he did. Took up some boxes. The students studied them, analyzed them, wrote papers on them. And then they brought it back and brought some more. Then the Warsaw Uprising took place. And the entire collection, except these boxes that were in his apartment and those letters that they had made notes on, were completely destroyed. Just an enormous, enormous archive of material on the experience of our people in immigration that was lost. So we only have a small collection, but it's a fascinating collection. It was published by the Kulas, and then it was translated into English and published in English, and it's called Writing Home. And the letters are interesting in themselves, but when you know their history, that's what really makes them fascinating, because these letters did not get delivered. And I just want to read you a couple, just to give you an example of the poignancy of that. Here's a young man, John Zabotny, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, writing to a woman he hopes he can marry, Stanisława Gredzynska. It says, "Dear Stasha, first of all, I ask you about your sweet health and prosperity." He's trying to butter up here. Sweet health, okay. "I thank God I am well, and I wish for you also that you are well. Now, dear Stasha, I am very disturbed because I wrote you a letter and you have not answered me. Did you get married already? Or are you angry with me about something? I am happy to return to the old country, and I would be happy to marry you. If you would like to hear, I would like to hear a kind word from you. And you, Stasha, what do you think about it? Will you wait for me? So please write to me and let me know if a second letter has reached you, because I did not receive an answer to my second letter. I have nothing more to write, but I send greetings to you, dear Stasha, and my future in-laws, and wish you a happy holiday." Never got there. Stasha doesn't know anything about this profession of his love for her. Here's another one, Michael Golombiewski, who appears to be a Lutheran, who's writing to Anna Kropkowska. It says, I wish you a happy new year, my panna, so that all will go well with you during the new year. I send cordial greetings for your happiness and health, and I bow to you and the same to your mother and father, and I wish them good fortune. I, with a bow, write these few sweet words to you, my panna, so that you will answer me at once. I want to send you a steamship ticket if you wish to have me as your husband, because I have fallen so much in love with you. I do not hold you in contempt, and I always carry you in my heart. And I write this to you, that America is good, 100 times better than the old country. There is only misery. Here everyone is dressed nicely and is close to church, and that is so good. And I'm working every day, and I am well dressed, and here everyone dresses well. You will also be well dressed when you come to live with me. I will even convert to your faith if you come here. Now I greet you 1,000 times over, as if you were my sweetheart, and the same to your beloved parents. Keep well during the new year. Regards also to all your girlfriends. If they wish to come, let them come, because there are plenty of good men here. There in Poland, there are only bandy-legged ones who don't know how to love women. So it's us American guys that that are the real. She didn't get that letter. And when you look at that, how many of these stories, how many letters from mothers to their children, children to their parents, cousins, letters saying, please come, everything's ready, I've got a job for you. And they never get there. So it's one of those sad stories. I also draw on my own research. I've written on Polish religious orders of women, women in the labor movement, and I've written several things about the Polish Women's Alliance, Związek Polek. So that's kind of where I draw my my work from. Now, immigration in the Polish countryside already existed before people started to come to America. Much of it was local and regional, and it involved women as well as men. In fact, in many cases, for local and short distance immigration or migration, women were favored over men. They were the most expendable in the family economy, and they could go and send their earnings back, which they would not have made on the farm, to keep the family on the farm, to buy new land or tools, or, as many wanted to do, to earn their dowry. Initially, however, the long-distance migration was at first drawn mainly from the male population. And their leaving had a tremendous impact on the women who stayed. And that was really the first impact of immigration on women. By the way, there were gangs of Polish women from old Stara Galicia and from the kingdom who traveled every year, sometimes without legal permits to work, to Prussia. Let's face it, our grandmothers were all wetbacks. They snuck across the border in many cases because they didn't have permits, and they worked on the great Prussian estates. Gangs of about 60 women from a single village or surrounding villages would go, and they'd work all summer, and they'd follow the harvests in Prussia. And they would save their money, and there was, of course, a great deal of protection in numbers, so they always traveled together, and they came back at the end of the summer to help at their own harvests, and at the same time, of course, put away money to help the family, and of course, for many women, to make a dowry for themselves. But the men who left first created a hiatus, an emptiness. Wives and daughters had to assume new roles. They had to take on the responsibility and the work of their husbands and their sons. Their traditional roles expanded as they raised children alone. They had no fathers. The new arrangements often put strains on the family. Wives did not readily or easily return to their traditional roles when the husband came back. So the guy spent 3 years in Pittsburgh or in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, digging coal, and he comes back and his wife has gotten used to running things without him. And so a lot of friction when the newcomers came back. They had kind of lost their place. And the wives didn't return to their traditional roles very easily. They often ignored his attempts to guide family affairs from a distance, and they resisted even when he came back. Sometimes they found themselves alone for years, or even in some cases, they found themselves abandoned as their husband chose not to return and found another wife in America. At other times, a wife refused to leave her home and join her husband if he decided on a long-term or permanent stay. In a few rare cases, they abandoned their husbands. One of the things we see in these collections of letters is how many letters there are from husbands writing to their wives saying, "How come you're not answering my letters? What's going on over there?" Let me just give you an example. This is Paul Kuhorski writing to his wife. He's in Northampton, Massachusetts. He says, "Now, the first words I speak to you, dear wife, praise be Jesus Christ, and I hope you will answer forever and ever. Amen." By the way, all Polish Catholic letters start that way from the immigrants. "Now, dear wife, I am sending you our marriage certificate, which was taken out with you under oath. My dear wife, now I am informing you about my health. I am well and happy, thank God. Now I send you my beseeching words, and I want to know, do you think you want to live with your parents, or do you want to live with your husband who is married to you forever and ever? Because I want to live with you as the world lives, that is in pairs as God commanded. I wanted to have you with me. My heart aches for you and for my daughter. When I go to bed in my dreams, I always think about you and our daughter. Perhaps you are afraid to come to me. Do not be afraid of anything. We will live as God commanded. If you want to come, please answer me at once, and I will send you a steamship ticket." Again, that letter didn't get there. And there are so many others very much like that. One of the things that very funny that from our own perspective now, but one of the things that many men used to try to lure their wives to America was how good it was going to be here. America is a great place, and one of the most common attributes of life in America was, "You will live here as though you were married to an organist." In Poland, obviously in the village, the organist was a big guy. And so if you come to America, you'll just be like you're married to the village organist instead of just me, a poor worker. By the end of the 19th century, young women were going abroad in increasing numbers with their families or in small groups of relatives or acquaintances, and sometimes even alone. We have reports in Chicago of the Agency for Protection of Women and Children, that there were, for example, in that one summer they did a count in the Polish neighborhood. There were over 2,000 Polish women who had come alone. And they were living with people that they, when they came in, announced were their friends, but they hardly knew these people. So there were some women who were adventurous enough to leave and go on their own. Many of them, other women who migrated, were going to join their husbands, of course, but they had to arrange their voyage themselves. They sold or leased the land, bought tickets, arranged local transportation, border crossings, sometimes illegal, aided only by vague instructions from distant husbands. Women who had had very little experience beyond the village, or had traveled as migrants only locally or regionally, now traveled across Europe and across the ocean, alone or with small children. They carried with themselves much of what was important to them that they owned. We know the trip could be very dangerous. Police reports in cities all along the Immigrant Trail recorded the disappearance of girls without a trace. On trains and ships or at temporary boarding houses, women were subjected to sexual harassment and even rape by crew, workers, or fellow travelers. One of the fascinating reports that's available is from the 1911 commission, the Dillingham Commission, that studied the life of immigrants in America. Its main purpose was to discover why those immigrants should not be here. But what they did a pretty extensive survey, and one of the most important reports that the Dillingham Commission produced was a report by a young Czech-American girl. She was born in the United States, but to Czech parents and spoke Czech fluently. She was sent to Europe and traveled in disguise, in steerage, to provide a report for the Bureau of Immigration. And she describes in graphic detail the difficulties faced by young women traveling on immigrant ships. She wrote, "One steward who had business in our compartment was as annoying a visitor as we had, and he began his offenses even before we left port. Some of the women wished to put aside their better dresses immediately after coming on board. As soon as they began to undress, he stood about watching and touching them. They tried to walk away, but he followed them. Not one day passed in the entire voyage, but I saw him annoying some women, especially in the washrooms." So this guy followed them right into the lavatories. "One night when I had retired very early with a severe cold, the chief steward entered our compartment, but not noticing me, approached a Polish girl who was apparently the only occupant. She spoke in Polish, saying, 'My head aches, please go away and leave me alone.' But he merely stood on, and soon was taking unwarranted liberties with her. The girl, weakened by seasickness, defended herself as best she could, but soon she was struggling to get out of the man's arms. Just then other passengers entered, and he released her. Such was the man who was to be our highest protector in court of appeal. Finally, not one woman in the steerage escaped attack. Some few women perhaps didn't find these attentions so disagreeable. Some resisted them for a time and then weakened. Some fought with all of their physical strength, which was powerless against a powerful man. Two more refined and very determined Polish girls fought the men with pins and teeth. But even they weakened under this continued warfare and needed some moral support about the 9th day. The atmosphere on the ship was one of general lawlessness and total disregard for women." So, as we know, sexual harassment is not something new. And immigrant women traveling on ships or going in boarding houses, in places where you wait to take the ship, often found themselves victims. After arrival, single women usually moved in with relatives or friends. Sometimes, however, circumstances put them with people they knew only slightly or not at all. Many of them worked some distance from their place of residence among men and women of other ethnic groups. Wherever they found lodging or work, that's where they stayed. They also found the social structure, the networks of gossip, the extended family that had restricted their activities in the village much weaker and less constraining here. One of the things they found is that the tight world of the village, which kept everybody in line, was not so tight here. They worked far away from the people that they knew. They could go downtown, escaping from to find theaters, shopping, window shopping, whatever, to escape from their neighbors. So the networks of gossip that kept people in line were much weaker and less constraining here. The young immigrant woman developed a sense of her rights and possibilities for greater control over her life choices. She changed jobs on the advice of friends, got her own paycheck, and often negotiated with her family about how much she would keep and how much she would contribute. She picked her own husband and arranged her own wedding, aided only by girlfriends and sisters. By the way, but the women before that, I forgot what I wanted to say. The women who were coming here often got a lot of advice from their husbands or their relatives as to how they should behave. And I found this one letter which I call Dressing for Success in America. Now I will tell you how you should get ready for the voyage. Whatever things you have, take them with you. Naturally, it will not pay just to take any cheap thing, as there are already enough ragamuffins in America. Antoinette, this is his sister, can take her best dress with her, but we advise that she should not take those that come to her mid-calf, as is so often worn there. If she came with that kind of dress in the first place, she would look like a kujavyak. Imagine that. And secondly, American children would throw rocks at her. So if you showed up wearing those village dresses, you're going to make her brother look bad, actually. So he also gave advice to his uncle coming and said, you need to buy low shoes, splatterdashes as they were called, German. And don't tuck your pants into your boots, because then you're going to be definitely a greenhorn. One of the problems that, of course, all of this caused is that you got married without your parents' blessing. We have a letter here from a young woman, and there are a lot of these, but she says, it's a letter. She's illiterate. She can't write. Her husband is writing it, but the husband is one she found here in America. And she writes, I, your daughter Helen, speak few words to you, my dearest, most beloved mother. I thank you for 100 times for the upbringing until this time. I now have put aside my maidenly status and have entered into a marital relationship. So, dearest mommy, do not be cross that I was married without your knowledge. I did it so that you would not forbid me to get married in America. Laying it out there. In the old country, there are not many chances, and so there was no need to hurry. But it is true that the man who is now my husband pleased me. He loves me, and he will never stop loving me. And so, my dear mother, do not be displeased regarding us, but accordingly condescend to bless us for our future life, because it is the will of Almighty God. As the saying goes, if something is meant for someone, it will not pass him by. So obviously it was destiny, karma, that this fellow, she found this fellow. Anyway, then at the end of the letter, he writes and says, now, my dear mommy, somebody talking to her as though it was his mother-in-law, I must inform you about myself, that I come from Austria. The daughter is from the Królestwo, from Russian Poland, from the city of Debovich. I'm a craftsman. I know how to make linen. And if God gives me the health to wait to earn a few cents, I will return to the old country, either to you or to sister, wherever my wife wishes to be. It is all the same to me, since I am already without a mother and a father. And he goes on, once again, dearest mommy, we kiss your hands and feet, and I beg you for God's blessing. We also send our greetings to the sisters and brothers. Keep well, all of you, until our pleasant reunion. Your grateful children, Carl and Helen Swansky. So, that was a trauma. Suddenly your children leave you. Maybe you'll never see them again. And they often marry somebody you don't know. You didn't pick for them, as you would have in the village. And, of course, one of the important things is that in America, it was so much easier to get married, or at least for most people. Have a letter from a guy, John Chmielewski, who's writing to his mother, and he's complaining. He said, "Dear mother, I myself do not know what I should do because years are passing me by. So I think I should get married in America. Except in America, a boyfriend has to buy a girl all her wedding clothes and all the pots and pans needed for the house because that's the custom in America. I do not know what to do." He doesn't have the money, so he can't get married. In America, it's the guy that has to come up with the dowry. Another letter in the same vein is a very interesting one. In America, if a man has $300, then this is a woman writing back to her mother. If a man has $300, then he can get married. Because in Chicago, the custom is that the girl's boyfriend must even buy her wedding dress and everything else that's needed for the house. The young woman only has to worry about getting to the wedding. Here they do not ask my mother how much dowry she will receive. So, and one of the things you see in these letters is how much women here writing back saying, in one case a woman gets a proposal from somebody in the village and she says, "Ha! He wants $100 American to marry me? In America, he has to pay me." So things changed for these women. Suddenly they were freer. They could make all sorts of decisions. They could regulate their own lives to a greater degree than they had before. We do have one letter that I found of a young woman who writes to her mother that she would like to get married, but all these Polish guys she meets here, all they're interested in is making money, and they don't want to spend money on a wife. And so, no, I can't find any guys that want to marry me. She's obviously in the wrong town. One of the problems is, of course, that for men was that the immigration was heavily loaded with single men and much fewer single women. So it was easy for women who were in any way attractive or eligible to be able to write their own ticket. Many immigrant women made their homes without the assistance, and this is married women now, of their or advice of their mothers and mother-in-laws in an environment that was very different from the one in which they were raised. Life in the New World changed the situation of the married woman. She had to assume new public roles as her husband went off to work 6 days a week, sometimes some distance away, for 10 or 12 hours a day. One of the things people kind of mistake about the history of the family is that until very recently, most rural families, both the father and the mother worked at home. It's only during the Industrial Revolution, when people came to work in the cities, did the husband go away. And that was only when he could make enough so that all his wife and kids didn't also have to go. So the idea of the husband going away is a kind of late 19th, early 20th century idea. So the husband was almost always there in the house, in a rural community. But now, with the husband away at work 10, 12 hours a day, the wife had to take on a lot of responsibilities of public life in America, about which she knew very little. Urban residents required a greater participation in public life and more contact with public and private agencies than was true in the village she left behind. The immigrant woman often acted in the name of her family. She dealt with city officials, teachers, social service agencies, settlement house workers. And as the Polish parish grew and assumed all sorts of responsibilities that it never had in the old country, these new social and religious functions, it fell to the immigrant women to carry out and support. It would be impossible to imagine the growth of the Polish parish in America with all of the services and all of the activities it had without the deep, deep commitment of Polish women. Polish women formed a wide variety of formal organizations to replicate the networks they had left behind. The organizational fever which gripped Polish men, founding all sorts of organizations, insurance societies, clubs, also gripped women. The majority of these organizations were religiously based, but there were also many tied to neighborhoods, settlement houses, social networks, insurance, and moral and educational uplift. Some of these organizations became regional and even national in scope. Like their single sisters, Polish women developed a new sense of their rights in America. And very often one of the things we find is the records of the police in Polish immigrant neighborhoods seeing an increase in women complaining about their husbands if they were abusive, making complaints about their kids if they were truant. In the village, these things would have been handled by their relatives, by local gossip. But now if their husband was abusive, more and more they turned to public service agencies, to the police, to social workers. And we see a tremendous growth in that. And the women who worked at home also made money at home. Some of them worked in jobs like seamstresses. In one of the most common occupations was they opened a saloon in their house with lunch. The husband was at work. And we have 3,000 saloons in Chicago, run basically out of people's living rooms in the beginning of the 20th century, just before the First World War, in Polish Chicago. The most common job that women did, however, was a boarding house. 50 to 60% of Polish families took in boarders. And that meant there was a great deal of, aside from taking care of your own family, 5, 6 kids, your husband, taking care of the house, the garden, you also had 5 or 6 other guys living there. Very often if your husband was at work, you better keep a spoon to beat him off sometimes. But even if they were well behaved, you had to wash their clothes, you had to feed them. And so you had this huge family. Sometimes they're much larger than 5 or 6 people. So that women earned about 2/3 or 3/4 of what their men did in working in heavy industry by just taking in boarders. We have a letter of a woman who writes back saying that to her mother, saying she was ill, but thank God for her husband, who was such a good guy, that he took over her work while she was ill. It was actually whatever illness it was postpartum. And she said, because we have 6 boarders, and he took care of the boarders. So he was really helping out at home. So in addition to caring for her own family, her newborn child, obviously her illness, she was expected to take care of 6 adult guys who wanted their food, who wanted their clothes washed, etc. One of the things we look at is we look at the home as one of the key pillars of Polish ethnicity. What does it mean to be Polish? Where do you learn that? Well, one of the key places you learned that was home. And if people look at what the markers of your ethnic identity is, it's food, Christmas customs, Easter customs, home culture. These are the kind of elements of the personal ethnicity that still mark most Polish Americans and other groups. You may move away from the old neighborhood. You don't go to the old church anymore. You're not a member of the same clubs that your father was. But what makes you Polish? Well, we have Święconka. We have Vigilia. We have these recipes. We have these stories my mother told. For most people, that remains the key element. And it was created by women. Long after the organizations that their fathers founded, which were very, very important to be sure, which were left in the old neighborhood, in the old church, what was left was what your mother gave you. And there were other important Polish organizations that also supported this role. And one of the most important, there are many, but one of the most important I'd just like to mention in passing was Związek Polek. It was founded in 1898 by Polish women who couldn't get into the Polish National Alliance. So they founded their own organization. And it became very, very successful. It published a very important newspaper called Głos Polek, the voice of the Polish woman. And it had all sorts of things, all about the world news, about women all over the world, focused on the problems of women. And their main goal was promote knowledge and education for the housewife, how to take care of your kids, how to cook your food, what are sanitary practices, what books you should read to your children, votes for women, and education for women. And also to support the important work of Polish factory workers, women especially. Magdalena Milewska, one of the leaders of the Polish Women's Alliance, went to a strike in Milwaukee of seamstresses, and she said, "The average woman does not realize that every time she puts on a silk dress to go to a ball, she is putting on the shroud of a sister woman who is unable to eke out a mere existence on this work." These are primarily Polish workers, Polish women. Says, "Your battle is just. It is the protest of women against abuse. It should meet with the support of all Polish organizations and the Polish press. Your victory will be women's victory." And they were not afraid. They supported the church and church organizations, but they were not afraid to talk back. There was an editorial in the Dziennik Chicagowski. This was before women could vote. This was a newspaper allied with the Resurrectionist Fathers in Chicago. And the editorial said, "The church has nothing against and certainly does not condemn equal rights for women, except that it's necessary that women be mature enough for them." The editors of Głos Polek shot back, "Ha!" They started with, "Ha! A people becomes ready for freedom when they get it. As the Negroes grew into it when they were emancipated, as the Chinese matured into it when they want freedom for themselves. In the area of rights, everything must be taken. One must never wait to be given. And so with woman, when she struggles for a right, she must win it and take it." Now this is 1900. Polish women in Chicago writing. I always liked another editorial in which they wrote that in regard to organizations which have both men and women members, Głos Polek wrote, "They do not today give a free and independent field for work and thought to women, and in them the shaping and influencing of decisions always falls to men." It says this happens even when men with the best will want to let women participate, because the centuries-old arrangements by which men rule and decide and women always obey. So we can only have joint organizations, we can be equals only when the will to rule disappears from man's soul and we can accept a woman as a truly completed equal person, not a minor child. So, and I estimated that probably 20 to 30% of Polish women read the Związek Polak because it was passed on and used in all cities that had chapters. So Polish women did not have to go find Anglo-Saxon feminists speak for them. They had their own message, and they knew exactly what they were talking about. And in some cases, they were far in advance of the arrangements and the ideas in American society. One other group that I would just like to mention in passing, and you've probably seen the picture come up, is one of the key areas that women participated in and really affected the community. And I would say another pillar on which American ethnicity was built, Polish American ethnicity was built, was the religious orders. Over 800 parochial schools were established by Polish Americans, and they were taught by Polish American nuns. Only 2 of these orders came from Poland. The rest were founded by Polish women in America to teach their own brothers, sisters, cousins, relatives. And the 2 that came over quickly became Polish American rather than Polish orders. When the Felician sisters celebrated their 100th anniversary, they had been founded in Poland, 80% of all their members lived in the United States. And unlike the European orders, they were primarily engaged in teaching. And so they taught generation after generation of Polish Americans how to read standard Polish. Remember, these people didn't speak standard Polish. The first time anyone from Poland often saw a play was in Chicago or Detroit. They heard standard Polish spoken. My grandfather, I can say with some surety, never attended a Chopin concert in Radzilowski. These were experiences that they had in the United States. They learned to be Polish here. And it was Polish American nuns that taught them how to be Polish. Preserved the language, preserved the faith with all of its Polish cultural elements, and educated their children for life in a Polish community, and also increasingly, as the second generation moved on, to life in America. And they did a magnificent job. They wrote textbooks, developed curricula, and helped to create communities. One of the things that we often think of is when we think of nuns, people leaving their homes and going off to the convent. And then they never saw their families again. That was a complete nonsense. They remained tied to their families and their neighborhoods. Maybe they never taught in the school from which they came, but they taught next door. They created what I call nun networks, networks of parishes, and they mobilized the women in these auxiliaries to raise money for them and to carry their mission into the community. We don't realize how important this network was. It wasn't the priests that tied together the community. It was the nuns. If your school needed risers for the Christmas program, you could say, okay, let's call St. Casimir's. They have them. So you bring them over. And one of the things I found is that Polish parochial schools sometimes had different orders of nuns. And so you might have the Sisters of St. Francis from Loretto in one school, the Felicians in another, and the next parish over were Felicians. So this parish and that parish talked. This one didn't talk to the other two because it was the nuns who tied it together. And so, and then they established their own colleges, their social service agencies, the hospitals, learning centers. They educated their own people. And so they created this other pillar of Polish American ethnicity that made it possible for the Polish community to survive. One just interesting fact from Detroit here is that the Felician sisters, who were the largest, they staffed 42% of all the parochial schools in America, Polish parochial schools. the Archbishop of Detroit took Sacred Heart Parish from the Germans. It's right next to St. Joe's, and gave it over to the African American community because they needed it. There was a number of African American Catholics, and they needed a church. The Germans didn't much like it, but that's bishops for you. And so he asked for people to teach. And the Felician Sisters volunteered to teach in the first black parochial school in Detroit. And they said to the Archbishop that we'll do this for nothing. This is our mission, to help the poor and the uneducated. And so they did. And it turned out very successfully. They turned out a lot of people who ended up in high positions. Betty DeRamus, for example, who wrote for the Detroit News, was a product of the Felicians. The interesting thing was, this was during the Depression. And where did the Felician Sisters get their money? Why? For the gifts from their relatives, from the Felician Sisters Auxiliary. So you have Polish Americans and Polish immigrants raising money to support the nuns who are using that money to teach African Americans as part of their Christian mission. I don't think we appreciate how much these orders did and how important they were during that early phase. And of course provided education, careers, etc. for a large number of women who didn't want to work in the factory, didn't want to get married. You could become an administrator of a hospital, principal of a school, president of a college. It was a safe way of education and social mobility for a lot of women. Finally, I would just add that one of the most important aspects also is the role of women in public life, and especially in the defense of basic liberties for America. One of the things very few of us know is that the CIO unions, which were very important, and despite some real flaws in the union movement today, they saved America in the 1930s. And there would have been no union movement without Polish Americans. 600,000 Polish Americans came over to the unions en masse between 1935 and 1937. And they were the most important single ethnic group in auto, agricultural machinery, steel, meat packing, and coal mining, the very heart of the industrial unions. But Polish American women also played an important role. Right from the beginning, they were militant in the coal fields. One of the great stories, the strikes in the coal fields in which the men were, of course, forced out of work, and they were the police and National Guard were brought in to suppress the strikers. So their wives went out. A bunch of women led by a woman who's probably a Slovak, Big Mary Septic, routed 400 scab workers who were coming to take their husbands' jobs. And pretty soon they were raiding all over the coal fields. The newspaper said, we've got to do something about these foreign Amazon raids that are shutting down the coal mines. Well, they were shutting down the coal mines. Finally, the National Guard suppressed them. We have cases of a strike in New Jersey, for example, where the police were brought in, and they turned their rifles on the men who were striking, and the women, Polish women with their babies, rushed to the front of the crowds and held them up and said, "Okay, shoot." It stopped the violence. So we have all sorts of stories. One of the most important of these strikes was here in Detroit among the cigar workers. 85%, you probably there, right there it is. 85% of all the cigar workers in Detroit were Polish women. And it was a tough place to work. To keep the tobacco moist, they shut all the doors and windows, and you had to, and turned up the heat. So many of the women, got interviews with some of them when they were old, said, when we went home, we had to stand at the back of the streetcar because we smelled so bad. Nobody wanted to be near us. And you had to eat your lunch right at the same place where you had the tobacco, and your sandwich got full of tobacco leaves. And there was a great deal of sexual harassment. Women were constantly propositioned to keep their jobs. And so when the auto strikes started, the women decided to go out on strike. And so they organized the longest sit-down strike in American history here in Detroit. 5 cigar factories in Detroit. And then they went to the UAW and said, send us a Polish-speaking organizer. We're listening every day on the radio to the Mr. Nowak, who was the head of the organizing for the UAW, and among Polish workers. He says, send them to us. And the UAW, ladies, please, come on. We've got important work to do. We're organizing the auto factories. We just can't be concerned with this. And so they said, okay, call the press. We're sitting in at the UAW. They said, okay, all right, we'll take care of this. But they were able to hold on for 90 days, except one of the factories where the police broke in and dragged the women out by their hair and beat them. But they had pregnant women getting visits from their families to make sure they were well. Nursing mothers handed in babies, were given babies by their daughters to feed and then given back so they would not break solidarity. They won. But all the cigar factories moved to Florida. That's why Detroit is not the second most important cigar factory center in the United States. Polish American women organized the Committee Against the High Cost of Living here in Detroit. They closed down 75% of all the butcher shops in Polish neighborhoods. And the women that were arrested, they were all married women in their mid-30s and 40s. They would prevent people from coming in. They said, we've got to do something about the high cost of living. It spread to Cleveland and other places, other ethnic groups, but the Poles were the most successful. In no other part of Detroit were more than 25% of the butcher shops shut down. But their children were starving, and the cost of living was going very high. One very funny interview I read in the Dziennik Polski here in Detroit in 1935. They interviewed a woman and said, "Why are Polish women so prominent in this strike?" The woman thought a minute and said, "I don't know. I think it's because we feed our men more meat." Says those English women feed their men cakes and pastries. And then she allowed, they seem healthy enough, but Polish women were at the forefront. And they fought for basic human rights against sexual harassment and in favor of decent working conditions. At a time when many of the descendants of the founding fathers would have denied basic human rights to people, it was Polish women who stood up. I think it's an important story. Let me just finish with one letter that I would like to read a couple of things with. This letter is just an amazing, I love it. I read it again and again. It's written by a young woman named Sofia Nadrowska. She's in Chicago and she's writing back to her parents. And it's in December of 1891. Dear Mother, dear Father, I received your letter on the 1st of December, which found me in good health, which I also wish for you. Now I'll tell you what I am doing. For 2 weeks, Trotka has not allowed me to go to work, but now I am working at a tailor shop. I am paid $2.50 a week, and I will soon earn more. I'm saving my money. I'm going to setting up my own tailor shop after Christmas. And I will let you know about it. And she asks that her sister be allowed to come. And then she says, her sister, she's wasting away. There's opportunity here in Chicago. She says, my dear mama, what do you think I am? Her mother must have reacted to this idea that her sister should come. When I said, what I said I will do, my dear mommy and daddy, I do not want to bring her to America so that she would be lonesome for you, but rather that it would be better for her than it is in the future. And so she sees these opportunities. She's obviously an ambitious girl. She's smart, hardworking, and it's a great adventure for her. She says, Chicago is Poland in perfection. They still think that in Chicago. He says, you can hear Polish hymns in the church. Lessons are different than you have there. It is very gay here, so that one can forget one's longing. And I cannot regret these 2 years, even though I would have been already different. But when I think about you, I am still very lonely. I am, as it were, still at home. There are three of us now. Helen is no longer with us. They live separately, but not far from us. We are sending you Helen's wedding picture, and the other one you should give to Pan and Pani Prenderevich in Roże. Helen's wedding dress, and I love this, Helen's wedding dress cost $30. It was canary-colored silk. Now she's making $2.50 a week. And what girl in the village would have had a canary-colored silk dress? Life in Chicago is really different. When you receive this letter from me and I receive an answer from you, I will send you my photograph. But you will probably not recognize me. It's only been gone 2 years. Dear Mommy and Daddy, do not be lonesome for me, because I thank you for sending me to America. I trust in God and the Mother of God that they condescend to hear my prayers so that I will take care of you until death, and you will die in my arms. Not going to happen, probably. She's not going to be there to hold her mother and close her eyes. And so many of these letters from Poland say, who will close my eyes? Who's going to bury me? So there's the whole immigrant story there. Ambition, there's opportunity. She's taking advantage of it. She's having a great time. Chicago's great. It's exciting. Her sister gets married and has this beautiful wedding in a $30 canary silk dress. But she misses her parents. And more than that, she knows her parents are weeping for her. If she gets married in Chicago, her mother's never going to see her grandchildren. And she's assuring them that when you're dying, I'm going to be there. You're going to be held in my arms. But probably not. I mean, there's the whole immigrant story is right there in these letters. And I like to just end with that as part of the explanation of women's experience.